Welcome to the webinar series for the Violence Risk Assessment Cadre. This webinar elaborates on the complex link between mental illness and violence. Please read the accompanying materials and remember that it is not a substitute for in-person trainings. No topic is more convoluted and controversial than the debate arising from experts who avow or disavow a link between mental illness and violence. This debate has raged for hundreds of years, but scrutiny of this topic has intensified over the last half-century. Such scrutiny coincides with two specific legal developments: the duty to protect laws and civil commitment laws. In the state of Nebraska, the duty to protect laws stem from the case of Lipari versus Sears, Roebuck and Company. Specifically, the duty to protect law holds that mental health providers have an obligation to protect persons who could be harmed by a patient or client. Such an obligation is twofold. First, it entails warning the target. That is, the duty to protect law overrides the confidential character of the clinician-client communications to the extent that such disclosure is essential to avert danger to others. As such, clinicians should notify the threatened individual that another person is posing a threat to their lives. Second, it entails taking reasonable steps to protect the threatened individual, which may include notifying and coordinating with law enforcement. State licensing laws establish the limitations of the duty to protect laws as well as the immunity granted by this law. In particular, the state licensing regulations indicate that 1. No monetary liability and no cause of action shall arise against any clinician for failing to predict, warn of, and protect from a client's or patient's threatened violent behavior, except when the client or patient has directly communicated to the clinician a serious threat of violence against a reasonably identifiable target. 2. Once the clinician has taken reasonable steps to communicate the threat to the intended victim and to law enforcement, the clinician should be discharged from the duty to protect obligation. 3. Finally, no monetary liability and no cause of action shall arise against any person who is a mental health professional for a confidence disclosed to third parties in an effort to comply with the duty to protect obligation. At their core, civil commitment laws establish a set of criteria that govern when an individual with acute or chronic psychiatric symptoms, by reason of their dangerousness to self or others, warrants mandated mental health treatment. In Nebraska, a person is considered dangerous and warrants involuntary hospitalization when they meet the following criteria: be a danger to self or others, as manifested by recent threats or acts of violence, or be in substantial risk of serious harm evidenced by an inability to provide for basic human needs, including food, clothing, shelter, essential medical care, or personal safety. To answer the legal questions posed by the duty to protect and civil commitment laws, clinicians must essentially assess whether mental illness plays a role in violent behavior. Clinical assessments of violence are complex because scientific evidence not always supports an association between mental illness and violence risk. For example, in 1983, Monahan and Stedman stated that there is no consistent evidence that the true prevalence rate of criminal behavior among formal mental patients exceeds the true prevalence rate among the general population matched for demographic factors and prior criminal history. These findings suggest that addressing the link between mental illness and violence was complicated by the presence of other factors that increase the odds for violence to a larger extent than mental illness did. Thus, mental illness did not initially appear to be a relevant predictor for violence. As research on this area progressed, some critics alerted that the data was likely inadequate and could not truly rule out an association between the two constructs. During the 1990s, researchers started to acknowledge that the association between mental disorder and violence was indeed present. For example, Monahan and his colleagues changed their former statements slightly after conducting the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study between 1992 and 1995. They found that violence among individuals with a mental disorder was mostly explained by other risk factors, such as gender, past violence, childhood victimization, personality disorder diagnosis, substance use, or psychopathy. These authors noted that mental illness was related to violence insofar as such illness reflected symptoms of psychosis. Psychosis is a heterogeneous syndrome that reflects a disturbance of cognition, emotion, and behavior that distorts perception, impairs reality testing, and alters behavioral control and activity levels. Monahan and his colleagues found that two symptoms of psychosis, paranoid thinking and command hallucinations compelling the individual to harm, increase the odds for violence. Other factors such as anger and recurrent violent ideation, which may occur with psychosis, were also associated to violence. Since these preliminary studies, psychosis has been consistently found to be the hinge between mental illness and violence. Specifically, Douglas, Guy, and Hart found in a meta-analysis of 204 studies that compared with individuals with no mental disorders, people with psychosis seem to be at a substantially elevated risk for violence. Specifically, psychosis was associated with an approximately 49 to 68% increase in the odds of violence relative to the odds of violence in the absence of psychosis. A more nuanced look at scientific evidence showed that the key to understanding the role psychosis plays in furthering violent behavior lies within its symptoms. Douglas, Guy, and Hart found that positive symptoms were associated with a larger odds ratio for violence than were negative symptoms. That is, symptoms of psychosis, such as hallucinations or delusions, seem to moderate the strength of the association between psychosis and violence to a larger extent than symptoms such as blunt affect, poverty of speech, or apathy. Specific psychotic symptoms may be related to violence in several different ways. These symptoms may provide a motivation for violence and be foundational for escalating risk. For example, individuals who experience delusions tend to voice rigid beliefs that often lead to very personal and inaccurate perceptions of their reality, which could be persecutory and conspiracy-based. These beliefs may provide the person with a motivation for violence and a sense of entitlement. Thus, individuals with such distorted beliefs often argue that violence is an acceptable way to redress their grievances and cannot understand others questioning their reasons. They are also likely to persist in their behavior and be less amenable to interventions due to their cognitive rigidity and sense of entitlement. If violence occurs, it is often well-planned, goal-directed, in line with the delusional beliefs, and directed at a specific person who is perceived as a persecutor or wrongdoer. Another type of delusion that has been associated with violence is threat control override, which refers to an individual's delusional belief that an external agent is either causing them harm or overriding their control of themselves. For example, individuals who believe they are being harmed may react with violence in perceived self-defense. Further, individuals may act violently under the delusional belief that external forces are controlling their bodies or that others have inserted thoughts of harming others into their heads. In addition to delusions, hallucinations have also been associated with violent behaviors. such as the case of command hallucinations to harm others, that is, auditory hallucinations such as hearing voices that instruct a person to carry out a specific violent action. The degree to which a person will comply with a hallucinatory command depends on different factors, including the identity of the voice issuing the command, the severity of the command, the underlying emotional reactions to these commands, the individual's level of insight and ability to cope with them, and how powerful the obligation to act on the command is. The risk of these symptoms become exponentially aggravated when the individuals also report violent fantasies. As such, it is recommended that further exploration of violent ideation is made during psychological assessment of positive symptoms of psychosis. Certain symptoms of psychosis may overwhelm the individual's ability to cope with daily stressors and interfere with his ability to find solutions to their problems in a peaceful manner, leading to impulsive, violent outbursts. For example, individuals who experience delusions or hallucinations may feel bothered by the content of their symptoms and feel angry or frightened, especially when they have not developed successful strategies to cope with these symptoms. These individuals are more likely to act aggressively in response to frustration. A common scenario is that of a patient in a psychiatric hospital or a homeless person who is actively responding to the input of auditory hallucinations and feels distressed. A well-meaning hospital staff member or a pedestrian may want to approach and console what may seem a person in distress, without realizing their presence can be perceived as threatening or terrifying. In this situation, the individual may react violently in response to fear or as an act of perceived self-defense. Individuals may also act aggressively when their symptoms include thought or behavioral disorganization. Individuals who experience disorganizing symptoms may not be able to articulate their needs coherently and/or direct their behavior in a goal-oriented or purposeful fashion. They may look bizarre to the external observer and even cause disruption. Because of the disorganized nature of their symptoms, these individuals may not be able to engage in clear decision-making or address interpersonal conflict effectively. In these situations, they may feel frustrated or angered. Given that their symptoms disinhibit behavior, they may not be able to control their impulsivity and anger, which may in turn manifest in violent acts. Less likely, symptoms of psychosis may exacerbate the risk for violence because they deplete the individual's inhibitory controls or natural deterrents for violence. For example, the ability of individuals with comorbid antisocial personality disorder and psychosis to experience emotions that typically inhibit violence, such as remorse or anxiety, may be particularly impaired. This is particularly the case of individuals who experience negative symptoms of psychosis, which typically blunt affect and emotional experience. On some occasions, individuals with psychosis may experience suicidal behaviors in connection with negative emotions like anger and sadness. Because suicidality is related to violence, symptoms that fuel both suicidal behavior and anger may increase the odds of violence, especially when violent thoughts may expand the focus from the self to include others. There may be several other ways in which symptoms of psychosis exacerbate the risk for violence beyond what we have presented. Thus, it is recommended that professionals conduct their own functional analysis of how the evaluee's symptoms may preclude violence. This functional analysis includes exploration of the following questions. 1. What symptoms is the evaluee displaying and how do they influence their behavior? 2. Under which circumstances or contexts do the symptoms appear and influence behavior? 3. What other factors may exacerbate the observed symptoms and the risk for violence? 4. What role do moderators play with behavior? 5. Who may be the likely target of violent behavior? Psychosis is not a necessary or sufficient condition to increase the risk for violence. Symptoms of psychosis may not be predictive for violence, since it heavily depends on how these symptoms influence behavior. This caveat is particularly important because of the legal repercussions and potential stigmatization of concluding that a person with severe mental illness is at risk for violence. Thus, when predicting violent behavior, it is recommended that practitioners give special consideration to externalizing disorders, comorbid substance use, and treatment engagement for the following reasons. Disorders, such as psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, are stronger predictors for violence than psychotic symptoms. In fact, compared with individuals with this type of psychopathology, psychosis does not appear to further elevate the risk for violence. Similarly, comorbid substance use disorders substantially elevate the risk for violence in individuals with psychosis. Thus, heavier weight should be given to substance use when assessing an individual's risk and designing a management plan. Finally, treatment engagement is crucial to determine if a person will effectively take their medications and attempt the necessary coping skills to regulate emotions and manage behavior. A lack of treatment engagement may lead individuals to seek other alternatives to alleviate their symptoms, such as misusing substances. These alternatives typically lead to relapse and increase the chances of violent behavior. In sum, we have presented a short overview of the aspects to consider when assessing the association between mental illness and violence. The major takeaway points of this webinar include: first, practitioners are asked to assess the link between mental illness and violence often, especially when duty to protect and civil commitment questions arise. Second, the relationship between mental illness and violence is complex and better explained by how symptoms of psychosis functionally affect human behavior and increase the odds for violence. Third, a functional analysis is needed to determine the particular role of symptoms in violence, motivation for violence, impairing decision-making or conflict resolution, and weaken inhibitory controls. Finally, remember that psychosis is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for violence. Thus, practitioners should consider alternative factors that may have stronger predictive power for violence than psychosis.